Hi guys, Ian here from the eChook team. I'm going to be showing you in this video how to set up one of these, which is a current sensor for your eChook Nano board. These instructions are all available in written format on the eChook Nano documentation, which can be found at eChook.com. And it's probably worth saying that they're probably applicable to other kind of telemetry boards that you might want to use. The LEM sensor will just give you a voltage out that you can then use to record in another telemetry setup, but these instructions are very much more entailed towards this board. Just give a little bit more advice on how to set it up for this board. What I've got here is an LEM HAIS 50-P, which is the one that the team recommends for the kind of currents that we see on the kind of green power cars that we use. I've got two 47 nanofarad ceramic capacitors here, one 4.7 nanofarad ceramic capacitor. I've also got 4 lengths of wire, and I've cheated a bit here to save some time on the video and prepped one earlier, Blue Peter style. And I've also got those connected to the 4-pin eChook Nano board current connector that lives up here. I'm on my own today for filming, so there may be a few cuts as I realign the camera. Hopefully I can make everything clear. Okay, so first up I'm going to be looking at wiring up the connector side of things. The 4 colours of wires are obviously up to you, but these are the colours that I particularly like to use and have in stock. So as you can see here, I've got the connector diagram labelled. So the eChook Nano will output 5 volts to pin 1 and 0 volts or ground to pin 4. So for those I've selected red for 5 volts and blue for ground. We've also got 2 other signals that come from the LEM current sensor itself. The 4 pins on here correspond to 4 pins on here. The other sensors signals that we have are current reference and current sense signal. So for those, for the current sense signal in pin 3 here, I've got a white cable, and then I've got a green cable here ready to go in for the current reference signal in pin 2. To do this, I'm just going to take a flat blade screwdriver, undo the terminal as much as I can, just check that the little tab in there has dropped right down. Take a piece of wire, just strip back the insulation, pop it in, and then I can just tighten it up. What I like to do after that then is just make sure, give it a little tug. Make sure it's clamped down on the wire there. You don't want it falling out on race day. So once you've done that with 4 wires, you can then strip the other ends of the cables, and what I've done here is just tin them with a little bit of solder, ready to go, ready for when we solder them up to the LEM sensor. Okay, so for the LEM sensor itself, it's a little more complicated. You've got to make sure you get this the right way round. You'll notice there is a slight bulge on the sensor. All this again is in the documentation on the website, eChook.com. What I've done here is I've actually folded the 4 pins slightly over to this side of the sensor. I think that'll just make it easier for me to solder all this up. I've also slightly chopped off this extra mounting pin. We're not going to use that, but I have left on the one back here. And that's because this needs, according to the documentation, for the sensor to be connected to ground. For that, all I've got is a small piece of wire. I've cut this just off the leg of a resistor. So what we've got here for this documentation is the pins that we're going to connect up. So 1 is for 5 volts, 2 is for 0 volts. Sorry, I should explain that pin 1 is up here, nearest the bulge from looking down at this sensor from this direction. 2 is for ground, current sense is pin 3, and current reference is pin 4. So all of these are wires that we've already made colours for earlier. According to the documentation, we need to solder on two 47 nanofarad capacitors, which I've got here. One of those, two of those, and a 4.7 nanofarad capacitor. What we're going to do now is solder a capacitor between 5 volts and ground, which will go here. I'll draw that like that. We're also going to solder a capacitor between ground and the output, or the current sense. So that's between pins 2 and 3. So we're going to do that here. That is the 4.7 nanofarad capacitor, and this is the 47 up the top between 1 and 2. All of this is in the documentation. There is a third capacitor, which is actually between pins 4 and pins 2. So that's a little bit more difficult because it bridges the gap. So I'm going to put that over the other side just to make things a little bit easier. Again, that's 47. Apologies for writing this upside down to you. So we're getting how to do that. Like I said earlier, we need to ground this pin. I'm going to use this little wire here. Hopefully that'll show up in the video. And that's going to go between pin number 5 and pin number 2, which is here, which is ground. All of this is just going to smooth out your sensor readings and give you better readings on your car. Okay, so I'm ready at this point to start soldering the sensor up. I'm going to start by extending pin 2 back this direction with an extra section of wire. That is going to connect to pin 5, as it states in the documentation, both for the LEM sensor and the eChook Nano. So I'm just tinning up a piece of wire. Be careful here not to tin it too much because you will burn your fingers. What I'm doing there, just dropping that on that pin. This is a little difficult. You might need some help from a teacher or a parent. Just tinning the other end of the wire there. Just going to rotate it round so I can get to it. Just a quick dab with the soldering iron connects it to pin 5. Just making sure there, not got any shorts between any of the pins because I've blobbed some solder across. We're okay. So I'm going to start now with pins 1 to 2, needs a capacitor. That's one of our 47 nanofarad capacitors. Just reading the side of this capacitor to make sure I get the right one. Ideally you want to keep them apart when you get them out of the packet. So this is a 47 nano. I'm going to start just by grabbing my solder and just slightly tinning both of the legs. Not too much like I've done there. Just wipe the end of my iron. What I'm doing here is just positioning that just so it lays across the top of the pins. And then I've heated those up. I'm going to now take the capacitor that's going between pins 2 and 3, which is the 4.7 nanofarad, tin the legs again in the same way. And because this one's going between 2 and 3, one of those pins is ground, pin 2. I've got a bit of extra length on the pin to use here because I've now got the other capacitor which is also connected to it. You can remember that ceramic capacitors are not polarized, so you don't need to worry about which pin goes to which side. It's not like a battery. So I'll just pop that on there. This is a bit fiddly. So that is now just sort of nestled on top of that second capacitor, or that first capacitor there. Again, I'm just having a quick check to make sure you've not got any shorts. If you feel you're worried, you can slightly get away with bending these legs on the outside out a little bit, but not too much. Certainly don't bend them back and forth so to snap them off. So we've now got 2 capacitors on there and our little ground section between 5 and 2. We've got one more to go. Now what I'm going to do with this one before I tin the legs is I want to put it between pins 2 and 4, which are a little bit further away than each other. So I'm just slightly pulling the leg out on it. Just going to tin those up. To save myself a bit of room, I'm going to put this one going the opposite side. Again, a little bit fiddly. Probably people with smaller hands would find this a little bit easier than I do. So I've just tinned that on there. And then again, just going to heat that up on there. Just going to add a little bit more solder to that. Just to make sure we've got a good connection there. And again, just make sure that all 4 pins are free. Okay, so now we're at a point where we've got the capacitors mounted and our ground wire connected. So we're now ready to take the piece that we made earlier, which is the connector. We've already tinned the wires on the end of this, so this is at this point ready to go onto this LEM sensor. So as we said earlier, red is our 5-volt wire. So straight away we know that pin 1 is 5 volts. Again, in the documentation this is shown, and we can just solder those 2 things together. If they're already tinned, you've probably got enough solder there anyway, just to hold those 2. This is where you've got to be really careful not to short the pins together on the LEM sensor. They are quite close. Got a little too much end on this wire, so I'm just going to chop that off. Blue, as before, is our ground, and on the LEM sensor that is pin 2. Already got quite a few things going to this pin, so when you do heat it up to put the ground wire on, the blue wire, do be very careful that you don't dislodge or desolder any of your capacitors or anything. This might be a little bit easier if you've got a spare pair of hands. A friend to help you solder this section. I'm just soldering that on there. You can always make sure with a little bit of a tug that it's nicely connected. So we've got red wire and blue, so that would be enough to power our sensor. This is that little blue guy getting some power from the eChook Nano board. But now we need to get some feedback from this guy over to our eChook Nano board, and that's from the pins 3 and 4, current sense and current reference. So back to our diagram from before, I can look up and see that current reference is a green wire. So that's going to pin 4, but we'll go for pin 3 next, which is our white wire. So that is going to be current sense, pin 3 on the LEM. I've already tinned it from before, so it's a simple matter of just placing it on top. Just heating the 2 together. Final wire that we've got is green, so if I go back to my diagram from before, I know the green is the current reference wire from or going to the eChook Nano board, and then I can go back to my documentation for the LEM sensor and realise that current reference is pin 4. Fortunately that's the pin that I've got left. I'm just going to pop that on there. Again, heating the 2 together, and there we go. We've got a nice setup there. What I like to do finally with this, to finish off the sensor, is we don't want these wires getting tugged. It's going to pull all these pins out of here and possibly damage your sensor. So what I tend to do, just tuck those under there, grab a zip tie, put it through here, and just tighten it down. It should still leave you plenty of room to get your main battery cable through the centre of this sensor, which is how it's going to sense the current going through it. just means that if you tug these wires, they're going to be nicely strain relieved. Just chop that off, and that's your sensor done. In my next video, I'll talk about how to actually check that this is working on your car or on your test bench.